A global reckoning on racism. Police killings in the United States trigger protests and debates on racial legacies in Britain and elsewhere. So can Europe and the US learn from each other? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The killing of George Floyd in American police custody has triggered protests around the world, some in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. Other demonstrations are calls to confront the legacy of racism in their own countries. Rallies in Britain have highlighted discrimination against minorities as well as Britain's colonial past. A statue of 17th century slave trader Edward Colston was dumped in Bristol Harbour last week. In London, city leaders removed a statue of another slave trader, Robert Milligan, and fearing more vandalism, boarded up Winston Churchill's statue before protests on Saturday. Far-right activists have held a counter-rally, saying they wanted to protect the statues and what they call British heritage. More than 100 arrests were made. Britain's Prime Minister has condemned the protests as racist thuggery. But Boris Johnson is accused of stoking division and saying anti-racism demonstrations had been hijacked by extremists intent on violence. French people also rallied against racism and police violence, highlighting the death of a black man in custody 4 years ago. And in Belgium, last week, protesters set fire to a statue of King Leopold II. Tens of millions of Africans were enslaved and died when he ruled Congo in the 19th century. Let's bring in our guests. In Providence, Rhode Island in the United States, Tricia Rose, Director of the Center of Study of Race and Ethnicity in America at Brown University. In London, Patrick Vernon, cultural historian and campaigner for the Windrush generation in the UK. And in Brussels, Ojiaku Wabzu, Senior Research Officer at the European Network Against Racism. Welcome to you all. I want to begin with you, Tricia, in the US. It's been 400 years. We've had slavery, we've had segregation, apartheid in effect, we've had extrajudicial killings, we've had black and ethnic minorities in the US traditionally do worse than their white counterparts. These have been problems that we've known about for a very long time, but right now, there does seem to be a moment where these things are being discussed in a much bigger way than perhaps ever before. Is that an accurate description?
I'm not sure I'd say ever before. I think the pinnacles of the civil rights movement and the Black Power protests were very significant and stretched out over a much longer period of time than we're as yet reached in the present sense. But it's a very important moment, and it is a high point of lots of activism that brought us here. And so there's a chance that it could be a big tipping point.
But let me just get into the structural nature of the racism within the US. It seems to me that it's slightly different from, say, the Europe and particularly the UK, where many people say it's immigration that is the root causes of the cause of racism. Here it seems to be that, you have a section of Americans who have been deliberately targeted and discriminated against by successive governments. They've been ghettoized, their neighborhoods haven't been given enough money. Why has that happened in the US? Why haven't they simply been integrated once segregation was over?
Well, the main reason for the maintenance of the logic of that drove segregation is that racism is not just a matter of personal belief. It's systemically applied so that hierarchies of value among groups of people can be maintained. And so while the civil rights movement and all of the other movements that led up to it were working very hard to create an even playing field, there's been tremendous resistance all along. The efforts to integrate public schools have legally succeeded, but in reality have failed. And that distinction applies everywhere in terms of job rates of discrimination in housing, rates of discrimination in terms of criminal justice and the ways in which it's applied. What's very unique about what's happening in the last couple of decades is that we're confronting the fact that we have a mainstream American society that has said that they themselves believe in racial equality. But whenever they're confronted with significant proof to the contrary, they develop an alternative narrative that usually relies on the behavior of African Americans in particular to explain these vast disparities. They don't like school, they drop out, that's why they don't have the same education. They don't save their money, that's why there's this extraordinary wealth gap. So there's a kind of narrative about the so-called failures of Black people that drive the resistance to really confronting systemic racism. So that's mainly why we're in this situation. And of course, there is a significant segment, although not a majority, of Americans who are old fashioned, old school racists, something that we don't talk clearly and explicitly enough about.
Patrick Vernon in London, let me bring you in. Traditionally in the UK, when it came to race relations organizations would look to the US for, if not guidance, at least inspiration. We'd look at Martin Luther King, we'd look at movements like that. But there are now in the UK leaders emerging, people emerging, who are talking about what it was like to be in those first generation coming over to Britain in the 50s. The Windrush generation particularly is the one that I'm going to ask you about. Those generations have faced a different type of racism from the one in the US, but it's had the same effect, hasn't it?
Absolutely, but just to let you know that we've had a long history in Britain of fighting for race and discrimination. You're going to go back to the times of enslavement. You had in Britain a Lord Equiano, a Black abolitionist, fighting for the abolition of freedom of Black people that were enslaved in the colonies in Africa, in the Caribbean, and the British colonies. And so we've had a long history going back about 200 to 300 years. And then the very first Pan-African Congress took place in London in 1900, organised by activists and academics. And in the interwar years, the 1920s and 30s, there was Charles Moody who formed the League of Coloured People. So we've had a long history of fighting race relations and discrimination in Britain. But the Windrush generation, who came post-1948, and many of the people laid the foundations of creating the Notting Hill Carnival, involved in the first campaign for the first legislation around race equality in 1965 and 1968. There was a colour bar, it was explicit racism, very similar to what was happening in the deep south of America. The only difference is we didn't have the blatant kind of lynchings and the type of violence that took place in America. But we had similar type of violence. But I think the racism that we're talking about now in 2020 is subtle racism, structural racism. It's not so much direct hate crime racism, still exists, but it's more about systems and institutions now.
In Brussels, Ojiaku Wabzu, can I just ask you, what are we talking about when we are talking about race in 2020?
That's a very short and simple question. We're talking about everything that our colleagues have mentioned before. I mean, we're talking about police brutality. Obviously, this is what a lot of protests have been about. But we're also talking about structural forms of racism and systemic forms of racism, which means that across Europe, we're seeing people of color, Black Europeans being more likely to be stopped and searched. We're also seeing people of color finding it difficult to get employment. There's a lot of barriers there for people to get employment. But also across all types of areas, we're seeing that people of color are either discriminated against or there are continuous kind of memorials to old colonial legacies that do not include people of color in the national identity and national history. So there's a wide range of forms of racism that people will experience living in Europe. And I would like to say that it's a common experience, no matter where you live in Europe. So whether it's in the UK or France or Belgium, you are likely to be experiencing racism along the kinds that I've mentioned just now.
But is there a difference between racism in Europe and racism in America? You mentioned structural racism there, the structures of how people are oppressed because of the color of their skin. Cities have been ghettoized, things like that. Is there a difference between Europe and the US in this case towards attitudes? Is Europe much more of a colonial attitude towards immigrants in its own country?
I mean, it's difficult to make comparisons between the US and Europe. First of all, Europe is made up of many different national countries, all with their own history and identity. But the experience of racism and discrimination is common in both Europe and the US. And I would like to say that it's not so easy to distinguish between slavery in the US and the colonial history in Europe, because it's all very much linked. So we're talking about systems of oppression, white supremacy, which is global. Racism is global, and you can see that also with the response with Black Lives Matters. So of course it's something that came up in the US, but its reach is beyond the US borders. You see Black Lives Matters protests since 2015 in the UK and other parts of Europe, and it's becoming something that people can identify with. It's not so easy to just say that the US had slavery and slavery on the US kind of grounds, and perhaps that didn't take place in Europe, but lots of European historic leaders were involved in the slave trade. They were involved when at least 19,000 Africans died in the Middle Passage and on their way to the US. So this history is very much connected, and it's not so easy to kind of make distinctions or make comparisons. We have to look at it in a kind of global way.
Tricia, it's a very interesting point. You can't really separate the history between Europe and the US. They have been connected for a very long time. But I want to talk to you about the rise of white nationalism over the last few years. It's seemingly much more vocal than it ever has been. It would be easy to blame the White House and the President Donald Trump's language for enabling these people, but is that accurate?
Yes, but it's not entirely the whole story. He has been extremely effective in galvanizing a dog whistle white supremacist ideology. And by that, I mean they don't explicitly at their marches usually say things like we hate Black people, we want to kill them, or we hate immigrant brown people and we want to kill them. But they ultimately are absolutely dog whistling violent forms of white supremacist speech. But it's important to remember that this is not the worst moment at all. I mean, it's a kind of strange idea that we could think that that kind of extreme white supremacy wasn't operative under slavery, under Jim Crow, under, after Reconstruction, so on and so forth. I mean, it was the dominant culture of the United States from pretty much its beginning until 1965 or so, right? That is the reality, that it was not just a country controlled by whites, but that it was controlled by whites with the express intent of suppressing all other people of color, stealing all the land from Native people, dragging millions of African people to this continent with the purposes of controlling their labor and their social standing for the purposes of expanding capitalism. And that developed an ideology around the fact that Black people are supposed to be understood in every possible way as subordinate. And whenever that subordinate status is threatened or challenged by Black people or by their allies, then you see a more vivid, crushing form of the return of certain kinds of white supremacy. So a few things in the last few years that made this happen has to do partly with the tipping point around the demographics, which connect Black Americans to other immigrant blacks from other countries, as well as many other brown people, especially Mexican Americans, but not only. And this wave of larger numbers of immigration connects the kinds of resurgent racism that we see in the U.S. to what you're seeing in Europe, because there's a very similar formation there. But it's also about a black president. We can't forget that, Barack Obama was a symbolic kind of a reorientation, which suggested that whites were not the presumed leaders of the government and of the policies that it produces. And no matter what his success was in terms of creating racial justice, that doesn't really matter for this point. The point is that symbolically, it suggested that black people could be on top. And we have to understand that, while structural racism is institutional and meters out a tremendous amount of harm at the level of economics and other forms of value, education, and so on, there's also just a psychic dimension to white power, white supremacy, which is that they must be the most privileged, and that drives the ways in which they extract resources from people of color and from African Americans in particular. It drives the logic that you could have a vastly different quality school system for them, but not for us. And so when the kind of emotional intensity that was behind the hatred for Obama, the hatred for this man, was absolutely one of the fuels that Trump has been able to gather and capitalize on in terms of fueling the support for, really just extremist white speech, which and action and policy, which we see in the government, not just in the Congress and the Senate, not just in Trump and not just in some fringe groups.
Patrick Vernon in London, you've been watching, like us all, the protests unfold in Parliament Square, where white supremacist groups, far-right groups, have been effectively fighting with the police. Are you worried that these groups are getting larger and they're becoming much more larger and much more vocal because of the social media, because of the internet in recent years?
These far-right racist white supremacist groups have always been here in Britain. You only can go far back as the 1930s. You had Oswald Mosley, prominent activist on the far right, and also MP. He had a black shirt, very similar to the Mussolini black shirts. They used to march in the east end of London, terrorising the Jewish community. And then you had, in the 1960s, Enoch Powell made his speech called Rivers of Blood, giving a vision of Britain where black people would kill and destroy main white people. And then you had the rise of the far right as a party, National Front, the BNP. So this is part of the trend in Britain. You always have these moments where the far right comes out and then they disappear again. And one of the reasons why they disappear, they're not organised. And number two, vast majority of people in Britain don't subscribe and support these far right extreme groups. And most of these far right groups are football supporters. Remember, we've had a lockdown in Britain for 3 months. Most of these fascists would be displaying their anger and frustration in the football fields and terraces and sporting events. We've been at home for 3 months, and they saw this as an opportunity to vent their anger and frustration. And there were some of them trying to target black campaigners. What's disappointing is Prime Minister Boris Johnson has compared this type of violence with some of the demonstrations and some of the skirmishes that took place outside the American embassy last weekend, and far from it, actually. And that's what happens all the time. People will compare, he called it the act of terrorism, especially when the statue was moved of a slave trader in Bristol. I saw it as a form of liberation. A lot of people recognise that statue, and many statues are offensive. But the statues themselves are not the issue. It's about structural racism in Britain that we need to address. And part of the problem that we have in Britain is, unlike America, at least in America, you have a conversation about race. In Britain, we pretend it doesn't exist.
Ojiaku, in Brussels, do we have a conversation about race in America rather than in Britain? You've studied both countries.
Yeah, I would say that in the UK, we are far more advanced in the conversation around race and racism and racial discrimination, and understanding that through figures and data that's collected very, very well, I would say, in the UK, similarly to the US. In Europe, it's a completely different story. I think that it's only in recent weeks that racism, like structural racism as an idea, has emerged on the front pages of newspapers and in the media. And it's a discussion that people are really not aware or able to understand how to have. Some of the questions that I've been asked are kind of interesting. It seems that there's a lot of explaining that needs to be done in Europe just to get us to a point where people understand what racism is. The data is not adequately available to show how pervasive racism is in Europe. And this is a really huge problem because people are not aware. And I think that this is one of the things with having, unfortunately, with George Floyd's murder, you can see on video somebody losing their life. And there's not that kind of video captured of incidents like that in Europe, not as many. And I think that that's what's happened in the US. There's been several cases of police brutality been captured on film, and quite rightly so. I think a lot of black people in America are saying we've had enough. But similarly in Europe, there are lots of incidents of racial discrimination, police brutality, racial profiling. But because it's not systematically collected, this data that I'm talking about, we call it equality data, just to know where each ethnic group or racial group is standing in society, how easy is it for them to get a job, how much are they earning, this kind of information we don't know. So to bring these issues onto the kind of public square to just discuss why there are these racial inequalities, it's really lagging behind.
Let me bring in Tricia Rose here. Tricia, this is a very wide-ranging question. I'm hoping that you will be able to answer it. We've talked a lot about structural racism, the structures of racism in the US were there. Black people were oppressed after segregation came to an end because they weren't given the same treatment as their white counterparts in white neighborhoods. Has that structural racism now changed in the US into institutional racism? Is it embedded now?
Well, I use a slightly different formula for the hierarchy of language. So systemic racism or structural racism is the biggest order of institutional racism. Institutional racism is more specific. So for example, if you want systemic racism at the big picture level examines how various aspects of society that are significant work in concert with one another to create chronic adverse effects based on the past and present, both past accumulation of negative effects, present policies. They take place in cultural ways, they take place in in policy ways, and so on. So that means you'd be looking at how the police connects to questions of, say, segregation. You cannot easily police Black people so differently than you police whites and others if you don't have housing segregation, right? If we had fully integrated housing, you couldn't have easy policies where you can have whole neighborhoods that are on police occupation level lockdown, because whites would be living there and they would be outraged and they would see the difference. They would understand the problem differently. Same thing's true with education. So if you look at systemically, you're saying education, housing, police, wealth, and other aspects of society work in relation to one another to reinforce each of those areas. Institutional racism is specific to a given institution. So that would be, say, policing, or perhaps criminal justice more generally, or education. So to me, those are institutions, and those institutions work in relation to one another in a way that connects them systemically, right? So that's how I connect those two levels of sort of the ways in which institutions embed themselves in structures and in systems more broadly. There's one other really important distinction, and that is that structural implies a kind of fixed process. And so I've used it, and we all use it, and it's important not to get nitpicky. But at the same time, systemic suggests that it's sort of happening the way it's supposed to happen, and therefore it's a little bit more flexible. It responds to the conditions in front of it to reproduce the outcomes it's trying to reproduce. But in both cases, structural and systemic are the biggest picture, and institutional are the various institutions that make up a systemic process.
Thank you very much. A fascinating discussion as ever to Tricia Rose, Patrick Vernon and Ojiaku Wabzu. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.